Sean los bienvenidos y las bienvenidas a esta tarde o esta noche o este día, dependiendo de la zona horaria donde ustedes estén. Tengo el placer de presentar este panel en soberanía de datos indígenas, centrado en reflexionar sobre la gobernanza y gestión de las comunidades sobre sus datos. Es un tema muy sensible e importante para la pertinencia y justicia cultural de nuestras sociedades. Y de hecho lo estamos haciendo hoy, que es el Día Mundial de la Ciencia por la Paz y el Desarrollo. Este panel tiene el honor de recibir a 5 personas involucradas en alma y mente en el tema, así que procedo a presentarlas. La primera persona será Magali Lázaro. Es una joven indígena del pueblo Oruca de Costa Rica. Estudió planificación y promoción social en la Universidad Nacional y está activamente involucrada en las reivindicaciones de su pueblo y en la Mesa Indígena de Costa Rica, que es una organización que articula a los diferentes pueblos indígenas del país. Actualmente también es asesora cultural de la FAO. Next, I will present the other panelists in English. The next panelist will be Desi Rodriguez Lombard. She's a Northern Cheyenne and Chicana. Presently is an assistant professor of sociology and American Indian Studies at the University of California, specialized in survey research in partnership with indigenous communities and other marginalized populations. She directs the Data Warrior Lab, which is an indigenous social science laboratory that connects researchers, students, and indigenous communities to build data that support strong self-determined indigenous futures. Next will be Candice Sudlovadik. Excuse me if I don't pronounce well her last name. Candice is a young Inuk who grew up in Iqaluit in Nunavut, Canada. She graduates from Environmental Technology program and has been working in the enforcement of that field with the government of Nunavut and most recently for the federal government of Canada. Candice has been part of the ICARVIC program since 2018, which focused on Inuit knowledge and the relationship between Inuit people and the researchers. She's part of the Arctic AIDER Society and the SIKU organization. Candice often represents these organizations in multiple international forums and conferences. The next participant will be Stephanie Russo-Carroll. She is an Ahtna woman from Alaska, USA. She works in the University of Arizona as an assistant professor for public health policy and management and is an associate director of the Native Nations Institute. Stephanie co-founded the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network and is a founding member of the chair of GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And finally, we will have with us Oscar Figueroa Rodriguez, originally from Texcoco, Mexico State. He is currently an associate researcher professor in the Rural Development Studies program in Montecillo campus in Campos, where he participates with the planning and evaluation of resources and programs research group. He is professor of the Territorial Development and Strategic Planning for Rural Development courses. His research topics are strategic planning, participatory planning, evaluation of plans, programs and projects, territorial development, and indigenous data sovereignty. Then I will give the microphone to Magali to welcome us in Costa Rica. Thank you. Magali.
Disculpen, ¿me escuchan?
Sí.
Muy buenas noches, tardes, días a todos los que nos acompañan. Un placer con los compañeros panelistas de poder compartir en esta ocasión con ustedes. Muchas gracias a toda la organización del evento también por considerar que de parte de los pueblos indígenas de Costa Rica podamos levantar un poco la voz y visibilizar nuestros trabajos hasta el momento en pro del resguardo de nuestros conocimientos como tal, como pueblos indígenas. Mi nombre es Magali Lázaro, yo soy del pueblo Urunca, Costa Rica, que quedan 2 territorios ubicados al sur. Yo soy del territorio Boruca. Mi profesión es planificación económica y social, pero mi escuela han sido todas las organizaciones de base indígena en mi territorio, en mi región y a nivel nacional, y además diferentes organizaciones de mujeres a nivel internacional que me han brindado la oportunidad de capacitarme en diferentes temas en relación a la defensa de nuestros derechos como pueblos indígenas. En esta ocasión fui invitada para hacer una introducción, aparte de que desde Costa Rica, en la voz ahorita de Gabriela Pino y la Universidad Nacional y en sí la academia como tal, en procesos muy respetuosos han estado en acompañamiento e incorporación con los pueblos indígenas de sus procesos académicos, y eso me parece un punto de partida importante, para lo cual se ha sido pues involucrada nuestra participación para dar estos acercamientos de quiénes somos los pueblos indígenas en el país. Comentarles que en Costa Rica somos oficialmente 8 pueblos indígenas que convivimos. De estos 8 pueblos indígenas hay 24 territorios indígenas que han sido reconocidos como un espacio geográfico reconocido en diferentes procesos, hasta una ley indígena que fue está rigiendo en el país desde los años 70. Sin embargo, existen 2 pueblos indígenas uno de ellos es un pueblo transfronterizo Nove, que está en constante movimiento entre Panamá y nuestro país, quienes también han estado haciendo bastante incidencia en el reconocimiento legal de sus derechos como un pueblo transfronterizo. Y también el pueblo Misquito, que si bien es cierto está reconocido en el país de Nicaragua por la migración que tenemos en este país y la población tan grande de hermanos nicaragüenses, también reconocemos un número bastante grande que también se ubica en espacios más urbanos, de donde hasta duplica a veces la misma población que existen en otros pueblos donde sí hay territorio reconocido. Entonces podríamos hablar de 9 pueblos y uno de ellos transfronterizo con los cuales somos y sobrevivimos en este país como pueblos indígenas. De esos 74 territorios, además, comentarles que estos son los reconocidos donde están los asentamientos indígenas, donde viven las personas indígenas, pero también habemos personas de los pueblos indígenas viviendo en las periferias de estos territorios y también a nivel rural. A nivel urbano, perdón. También los territorios ancestrales, de los cuales pues se hacen uso en la actualidad de diferentes espacios que son además considerados sagrados en nuestras diferentes cosmovisiones, consideran espacios que no están reconocidos como territorio, que son parques nacionales, que son espacios fuera de lo que se ha reconocido como territorio indígena, y estamos en constante lucha para el acceso al uso de estos recursos. Como vamos a hablar un poco de pueblos indígenas, durante todo el espacio de lo que significan los conocimientos de pueblos indígenas, quería hacer referencia a quiénes somos como tal los pueblos indígenas. En Costa Rica, como pueblos, tal vez el concepto que más, ¿verdad? Ha ido como aceptándose, pero que definiciones dependen de cada cultura y de cada pueblo para definir exactamente cómo, según sus medios, según su descendencia, según sus formas de toma de decisiones. Se han identificado que los pueblos indígenas son comunidades, naciones indígenas que, teniendo la continuidad histórica con las sociedades anteriores a la invasión precolonial que se desarrollan en sus territorios, se consideran distintos de otros sectores de las sociedades. Esto es una referencia que hago de don José Martínez Cobo, que fue relator especial de la Subcomisión de Prevención de Discriminaciones y Protección de Minorías. En este caso, pues es como la más general. Sin embargo, como menciono, cada pueblo define sus formas particulares para definir quién es, en este caso, de su pueblo, ¿verdad? Yo soy, decir indígena boruca es reiterativo, yo soy boruca. La cuestión indígena es cómo nos vamos metiendo todos esos pueblos en esa generalidad. Va a depender también de cada espacio para ser nación, para ser pueblo, o para ser para hacer una identificación de quiénes son los integrantes de ese colectivo. En el caso de los pueblos de Costa Rica, nosotros reivindicamos que las tres bases, ¿verdad?, que son la descendencia de estos pueblos, quién es el colectivo que reafirma además que somos de ese pueblo, y esa relación con los conocimientos que tenemos con el colectivo además, y ese respeto, y mi autoidentidad como indígena como tal. Y lo reivindicamos en esa tríada de conocimientos para que se pueda entender por qué en estos tiempos el tema de cuando, por ejemplo, a mí me ven en la calle y me dicen, ay, es que usted no parece indígena, como nos sucede aquí en el país, por esa invisibilización de quiénes somos los indígenas en el país, requiere de un conocimiento más profundo de esas tres diferentes cuestiones esenciales que hay para la identificación de nuestras identidades como pueblos indígenas. Y somos pueblos, no somos grupos, no somos etnias, somos pueblos indígenas. Y eso, les comentaba, también va a depender del espacio geográfico, al menos en otros países, cómo se reconocen como naciones. En Costa Rica hablamos de pueblos indígenas. Tenemos un marco legal favorable en este sentido. Existe una ley indígena desde 1973 que se crea también la Comisión Nacional para Pueblos Indígenas, que a pesar de que sistemáticamente ha ido perdiendo o no ha tenido un trabajo directo con pueblos indígenas, existe la posibilidad de avanzar aún más allá con la situación de la relación Estado-pueblos indígenas en este sentido. Existen políticas dirigidas o donde se incorpora la visión de los pueblos indígenas. Hace pronto, por un trabajo colectivo también de pueblos indígenas, se crea el Mecanismo General de Consulta para Pueblos Indígenas, que va en relación con esa protección también de los conocimientos, y hace poco también la Ley de Protección a la Nacionalidad Costarricense, la persona indígena transfronteriza, en ese caso los pueblos noves que les comenté en un principio. Como pueblos indígenas es importante que siempre hagamos referencia a nuestras cosmovisiones. Es la cosmovisión como entendiendo esa relación de la visión, el sentir y el orden del mundo que tiene cada pueblo, y que cada pueblo entonces tiene una cosmovisión distinta, por lo tanto hablamos de cosmovisiones también. Y estos trabajos que realizamos en los diferentes colectivos indígenas en el país van en esa visión de protección y de la protección del conocimiento por una convivencia realmente intercultural, que es la que tenemos en este país. Considerando inicialmente que se trata de como un eje pilar la espiritualidad que tenemos en cada uno de los pueblos. Si bien es cierto, en Costa Rica no tenemos una red como tal específica que luche directamente por la soberanía, por la autonomía de los datos como tal, de los trabajos, existen diferentes iniciativas territoriales que remiten a tratar de fortalecer, impulsar este esfuerzo al menos en el ámbito académico también, para incorporarlos con todos los procesos que se llevan a nivel territorial. En este caso les quiero comentar de dos ejemplos específicos, y uno de ellos es del pueblo Brorán, quien trabajó hace 2 años, y el año pasado ya se estrenó, una base de datos donde se identifican 12 troncos familiares para identificar quiénes son Brorán, desde sus troncos familiares hasta las descendencias que tenga cada uno de esos troncos familiares. Y ese esfuerzo fue escrito persona por persona, identificación, y un trabajo grande y de la mano entre el Tribunal Supremo de Elecciones y los mismos indígenas del territorio. Y esto fue oficializado y está completamente como uno de los documentos más importantes de identificación que tiene este pueblo. Esto es un avance muy importante porque esta base de datos de quién es o no es Brorán, quién es de las familias de los troncos familiares Brorán, quién es descendiente de esta, es un trabajo también de colectividad que tiene que ver con ese otro pilar que les comentaba, que es parte del principio indígena, pues que nos mueve como pueblo. Y en este caso el pueblo Brorán se hizo un esfuerzo grande para hacer este trabajo, y otros pueblos venimos trabajando en la posibilidad de generar un espacio, un documento de este estilo. Sin embargo, hay pueblos que son mucho más grandes, la cantidad de la población, los troncos familiares y las formas también de identificación, como son las Bribri y Brorán, perdón, Bribri y Cabecar, que son dos pueblos que tienen la característica de ser matrilineales. Sus clanes se pueden siguen adelante con la posibilidad de que una mamá traspase eso a sus hijos, el mismo clan. Entonces, esta matrilinealidad es una situación distinta a la Brorán, donde son matrilineales y también patrilineales. Entonces, esa complejidad además genera otras formas de acercarse a esos elementos que podrían generar en la misma incidencia que tiene un instrumento como esta base de datos de indígenas Brorán. El segundo punto que les quería comentar, otro ejemplo cercano a esta conversación que vamos a tener esta noche, con los ejemplos diferenciados de cada situación. En Costa Rica también se trabajó la política pública de biodiversidad, donde hubo una participación de los pueblos indígenas bastante importante. Entonces, la necesidad de ir más allá en la protección, dando seguimiento a lo que es el artículo 8J del Convenio de Biodiversidad, haciendo esta política, se logró trabajar entonces una estrategia con acciones diferenciadas que puedan generar esta protección del conocimiento de los pueblos indígenas en el área de la biodiversidad. Y en este caso, bueno, que para los pueblos indígenas significa pues una relación completamente recíproca que tenemos con la naturaleza, que significa un paso muy importante. Entonces, una de las acciones que se delimitó fue la creación de una plataforma de conocimiento de biodiversidad, donde se puedan compartir información que ya haya, ¿verdad?, de académica o consultorías, investigaciones que tengan que ver con conocimientos, identificarlos y poderlas tener en una especie de plataforma virtual, pero antes considerando quiénes son los pueblos indígenas que están relacionados con estos conocimientos y qué tanto ellos están de acuerdo de traspasar cierta información de la que ya está, también para resguardar algunas cosas que ya están publicadas y se han hecho sin ningún consentimiento de los mismos pueblos indígenas en el uso de los recursos como tal. Este proceso está iniciando, apenas se han logrado hacer todos los pasos políticos, pero ha sido es de mucha importancia para nosotros porque realmente toca nuestro corazón, nuestro ser, que son nuestros recursos, y es nuestra preocupación por lo que está pasando con la biodiversidad en el mundo. Y esto en relación a nuestros conocimientos tiene que ver con nuestra forma de realmente poder transmitir esa información de generación en generación. Entonces, esa sensibilidad sabemos que la han trabajado en otros países muchísimo más en relación a redes, a trabajos específicos sobre la soberanía del conocimiento indígena en general. Nosotros tenemos algunos avances, como les comento, en esos casos, y algunos otros en relación a idiomas, en relación a educación, que podría también comentar, pero bueno, por el tiempo, quise enfocarme en estos dos y quería agradecerle la atención y este espacio para mí es importante para motivar a todos los actores a nivel nacional, incluyendo las diferentes organizaciones, en la incorporación equitativa, ¿verdad?, de estas estrategias, tanto desde la parte indígena como la parte tecnológica para este tema de los procesos que se puedan mostrar de forma virtual. pero también me refiero en el sentido de la importancia de las mujeres en estos procesos, como salvaguardas directas de estos conocimientos en nuestros pueblos. Y entonces es, como les digo, una motivación y un impulso para nosotros en el país, para que todos los interesados nos podamos coordinar, organizar y poder generar espacios como los que vamos a conocer el día de hoy, y avances para una protección conjunta a nivel nacional de lo que significan nuestros pueblos. Entonces, agradecerle a Gaby por el espacio. La siguiente participante es Desi Rodríguez, por lo que le cedo la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Magali. Thank you, everybody, for participating and being on the call today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get through my presentation. Just a fantastic words about what's happening in Costa Rica with the indigenous peoples and their data. I'm a social demographer, and so hearing about the Broran people and their demographic work is just so fascinating, and I think it's so powerful. So I am going to talk about indigenous data governance in the United States, and if I can figure out how to share. One moment. Okay. Okay. Is that working?
Yes, Desi, perfect.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So I'll be talking about indigenous data governance in the United States and giving just kind of a bit of a background on indigenous data sovereignty and indigenous data governance and how that ties to tribal sovereignty and some examples of what that looks like in action. I want to just say, good afternoon. My Cheyenne name is Mukshihat. It means Bearment woman. I'm a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and Chicana. And I'm coming to you from the lands of the Tisistas and the Suttat people. These are my people in southeastern Montana. We're now known as the Northern Cheyenne Nation. And I want to acknowledge our ancestors, the past, present, and the future, for our homelands and our way of life and their sacrifice for that. I want to talk about 4 data truths and how these inform the work of indigenous data sovereignty and governance. The first is that all over the world, in every sector and all disciplines, there's a focus on equity and justice, whether it be in data, whether it be with regards to health care, housing, economic justice. The focus is on equity and how equity can translate and be a catalyst for justice. But for indigenous peoples, there is no equity and there is no justice unless there is sovereignty. And so sovereignty is at the core of this work. The second truth is that indigenous data are critical to the exercise of tribal sovereignty. The third is that only tribal nations can exercise indigenous data sovereignty. And the fourth is that doing data by tribes for tribes includes seeking out external data expertise and the importance of partnerships in this work. So this is a quote by one of my tribal leaders, our former president of my nation, John Robinson, and he said that tribal sovereignty is only as strong as we exercise it. And it really speaks to how we need to exercise sovereignty as tribal nations. And this quote really speaks to how data is central to the exercise of sovereignty. So this is a quote by another tribal leader who said that sovereignty as tribal nations was given to us by the Creator. It is sacred. And so data to exercise our sovereignty is also sacred. And so this notion of data as sacred, of indigenous data as sacred, stems from another truth, that indigenous peoples have always been data experts. We can go back to time, time immemorial, to the very beginning of our nations and our communities and our peoples, and we can find examples of data, of how data have been used for survival, about how data have informed, the worlds in which we live and thrive. in. And so here are some examples of that from the North American context. We have the totem poles, we have the winter counts of the Plains peoples, the wampum belt from those in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and then the Tohono calendar stick from those peoples in the Southwest. And so those are just a few examples of what are Indigenous data. And so when we're talking about Indigenous data, we're talking about data, information, and knowledge in any format that impacts Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at both the collective and the individual levels. And so this definition is intentionally broad. We talk about, it refers to data about our resources and our environments, about us as individuals, as individual Indigenous persons, but also about data about the collective, about nations and peoples as a whole. So with that, that brings us to this, what is Indigenous data sovereignty? Indigenous data sovereignty emerges from a rights-based framework. It is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection and the ownership and the application of their own data. We speak about it as having kind of four components. One being that it derives from the inherent right to govern, self-determination, autonomy of Indigenous peoples over their lands, their peoples, and their resources. The second is that it has this genesis in traditions and roles and responsibilities for community-held information. The third is that it's positioned within the human rights framework. We draw on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples significantly as a mechanism for Indigenous data sovereignty. And then fourth is that it is committed to advancing the fact that knowledge belongs to the collective with respect to Indigenous data, and that it is fundamental to who we are as peoples, as that collective. So what does this mean for where we are at right now with respect to Indigenous data? So we're in this time of we're seeing a shift in this paradigm of Indigenous data. So as a result of colonization in the United States and North America, it's over 500 years of invasion and occupation of our lands. In other Indigenous contexts, you know, the historical time frame is different, but the fact remains that our lands have been invaded and that we have been in a state of occupation. That also pertains to our data, the state of our data. And so this state of data dependency has ensued for our peoples, and it identifies the fact that the way data have been collected and analyzed as a result of this enduring occupation is that the data have been collected by others about Indigenous peoples. And we're seeing this shift from by them, for them, but to buy them for us in this kind of paternalistic state, to buy them with us. So in some sort of partnership model or a consultation model, which is quite popular in the United States, to buy us for us. That's the ultimate state of this of Indigenous data sovereignty, is ultimately where we are doing data by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples. And then we're also seeing, particularly with respect to climate change and other global crises, is that we're going back to Indigenous peoples for the knowledge of essentially how to save all of us, how to save our world. This place of by us, for them, for everyone. And so this is the data paradigm of the hierarchy of Indigenous data. I want to speak to what Indigenous data governance looks like and how the reclamation of Indigenous data sovereignty is occurring through Indigenous data governance and decolonizing data, these kind of interlocking forces, and give some examples of that. So you'll see here the shift from a data dependency to Indigenous data sovereignty is occurring through these interlocking forces. When we're talking about Indigenous data governance, we're talking about the means of implementing Indigenous data sovereignty. And it's the application of Indigenous ways of knowing and doing to the management and the control of Indigenous data. On the ground, what this essentially looks like is the nation is at the center. and it's controlling the data about its resources, its communities, its lands, and its citizens. So the governing of Indigenous data is essentially about data relationships and how we enhance those data relationships. And it has these two ends of the spectrum where it's about data stewards who are managing data by tribal standards. So these are external entities that have ascribed to the standards of tribal nations with respect to their data. And then the other end of that spectrum is about tribes who are governing their own tribal data. And both of these are critical to the exercise of Indigenous data sovereignty, and they both speak to what it means to govern data. So here we have this kind of exploration of rights holders and stakeholders. So in the Indigenous data governance world, the rights holders are Indigenous nations and Indigenous nations only. Only Indigenous nations have sovereignty. And so in the United States context, we refer to those as federally recognized, state recognized, and non-recognized tribal nations. That language is of course different depending on the nation state context. But then all surrounding those stakeholders, we have surrounding those rights holders, we have stakeholders. And that includes urban entities and urban communities, NGOs, advocacy organizations, intertribal entities, et cetera. And so the governing of data really follows this process of establishing the values and the principles, which then inform the institutions and the structures for decision-making, which then influence the policies and the procedures. And so these policies and procedures are what they inform these mechanisms for data governance. And those include legislation, partnerships, cultural protocols, MOAs and MOUs, data sharing agreements, collaboration. And so my colleagues will discuss a lot of this more in their presentations, but this is just kind of to give you the overall framework. And so specifically with respect to tribal data governance, this is what I want to really end with and hit home, is that tribal data governance takes Indigenous data governance and really shifts it down to the local level where the authority lies and where the power lies. And it is the act of harnessing tribal values, principles, and other mechanisms, Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and being, and applying them to the management and the control of a Native nation's data ecosystem, of a tribe's data ecosystem. And so what does this look like in action? Well, I want to give a couple of examples. In 2017, I helped to lead a national survey of tribal leaders in the United States to understand tribal data capacity and tribal data needs. We interviewed, solicited responses to the survey from over 280 tribes, which is the largest national survey of tribes in the United States. And four main outcomes or key findings emerged. One was that there needs to be more federal investment to support tribal data. Two was that tribal authority to integrate federal program funds are needed so that there can be comprehensive and streamlined data collection efforts. That there needs to be stronger partnership between federal agencies and tribes, and that there needs to be strong intertribal partnership as well. And so this project really serves as the kind of a national overview of tribal data capacity in the US. And 83% of those tribes who responded, they indicated how important it is for tribes to collect or have access to data on their tribal populations, specifically for governance purposes. So we really were able to tease out the connection between data and tribal governance through this survey. We also found that, you know, so many tribes are using data all the time. You know, there are data collection processes happening all the time, and that tribes are using data largely, you know, for grant requirements, but also to communicate with tribal members, for service delivery, to develop, you know, strategic goals, budgeting, etc. Basically, all of the things that a nation state uses data for, tribal nations are using that too, and also doing that. Some more examples that I want to share are, you know, we've got the Taos Pueblo Leads project, which is an example of data governance in action as well. It translates, or excuse me, the acronym is Leadership Engaging Actionable Data Sovereignty. So this is an example where the Taos Pueblo leaders, they described how external forces have created a need for long-term planning in their tribal nation, and how these processes work in contrast to the yearly traditional systems that have been used by the tribe. And so really informing a new way of doing business, one that, you know, is focused on long-term planning. And so they developed this project that is evidence-driven from within the tribal nation. Another example is the Swinomish Climate Change Initiative. So this is another case of tribal data governance in action, where the Swinomish Nation has partnered with other tribal nations in their region. They've tested existing indicators of community health to determine relevancy and to propose alternatives all around the impacts of climate change on their peoples, on their lands, on their waters, on their food sources, you know, on their fish. They've developed formal partnership agreements with other Native nations. And so this is an example of kind of that intertribal partnership for tribal data governance. I want to end with an example of tribal data governance from my own people, from the work that I've been very honored to do, which is to work in partnership with my Native nation to develop tribal demographic projections, and to really figure out what does the future look like for our tribal nation in terms of the sustainability of our tribal population, looking at, you know, the different requirements for tribal citizenship, and you know, where our tribal citizens are living. Are they living in urban areas? Are they living on the reservation? Are they intermarrying? At what rates? What does the future of our people look like? And so that was done in partnership with my tribe, the Northern Cheyenne Nation. And it was, you know, I utilized the tribal governance mechanism of a resolution through the tribal council to do this work. So that's another example of a mechanism to do tribal data governance. So I just want to close by sharing this slide of U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. We were developed to promote Indigenous data sovereignty and through decolonizing data and Indigenous data governance. Both I and Stephanie Carroll, who's on the call, are the co-founders, and we have you know, almost 400 people now in the network, and it's part of a much global data sovereignty movement as well that others will speak to. So for those of you on the call who are from the United States, we encourage you to join our network. You do not have to be Indigenous. You just have to be committed to the aims of Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. So I will just leave it there and say, Niash, thank you, and pass it on to the next presenter.
Thank you, Desi. And now we have Candice.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Candice Sullivan, and I'm currently here in Iqaluit. I'm going to be talking to you about SIKU, the SIKU app, and SIKU means sea ice in Inuktitut. So to get started, we're going to start off with a little video.
SIKU, the Inuktitut word for sea ice, connects communities across the Arctic. SIKU, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network. App and web platform created by and for Inuit, providing tools for weather, ice safety, and hunting stories, as well as knowledge transfer and language preservation.
The weather's changing, the ice conditions is changing. And when we're driving a snowmobile or walking, we have to think.
You'll lose your snowmobile.
SIKU puts Indigenous knowledge and observations front and center alongside weather and safety services, including sea ice products, tides, marine forecast, and satellite imagery. This lets hunters share dangerous and changing conditions with their communities using their own language and knowledge systems.
We used to get our information on 5 different websites.
Now with SIKU, all that information is in one place, also with the information from the elders and hunters.
SIKU includes profiles for wildlife, sea ice, and traditional place names in multiple dialects that are taggable and act as living wikis of Indigenous knowledge. Using the mobile app while you're on the land, posts such as hunting stories and GPS tracks can be recorded and uploaded to SIKU when you are back in your community.
Oral history has been a big part of the Inuit tradition. Nothing was written, so everybody just had a good memory.
Now with the SIKU, we are providing new ways how the Inuit knowledge and science can work together.
SIKU helps you document the data that has always formed the basis of Indigenous knowledge and mobilize it for use in community-based monitoring, guardian programs, and self-determination in research and environmental stewardship.
With SIKU, we get to decide how we share our knowledge.
SIKU is a safe place to share our hunting stories.
As the only social media platform putting Indigenous rights first, SIKU includes privacy settings tailored specifically for Indigenous knowledge, ensuring that no one can use your data without permission.
You become a hunter because you keep practicing and you follow, and you let the elders take the lead.
You still need your harpoon to stay safe on the ice, and now with SIKU, you can mobilize your knowledge, connecting hunters, elders, and youth for the benefit of future generations.
I think Inuit clothing, the feathers that we use, and traditional tools, combined with technology and the tools of today's modern youth, and you put them together, would be amazing.
Integrating Indigenous ways of knowing with a suite of modern technologies. SIKU, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network, now available for Android, iPhone, and online at siku.org, brought to you by the Arctic Eider Society.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to share my screen for my presentation. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes, you just have to put the slides in present. That's it, perfect.
Okay, thank you. All right, so again, hi everyone, my name is Candice Livanup, and I'm going to be talking to you about SIKU. So how SIKU was created was by doing many workshops in many different communities across Inuit Nunangat, which is across wherever Inuit inhabit. So SIKU has a very good potential, and once it reaches that full potential, it's going to be a very good example of how Inuit are adapting to a changing world using technology and Inuit Kawimayatqangit, which is traditional knowledge, to address the changes and promote safer hunting and traveling. Scientists have always been good at documenting everything, and Inuit knowledge is based on oral history. And we have often had to prove our knowledge because we are told that our knowledge has been anecdotal. And there wasn't really a traditional perspective of ownership, and with researchers coming and taking information from our elders and community members and claiming it as their own, and seeing these researchers thinking that they own all this data, we have often had to force to fight for our own data. So this app is providing self-determination in research for Inuit and allowing us to design and manage our own programs for environmental stewardship and share knowledge with younger generations. So just to give a little background on SIKU, it was a prototype that was created with the community of Sanikiloq, which is in the Belchel Islands in Hudson's Bay, and to facilitate Inuit self-determination in research, education, and environmental stewardship. So it's community driven, and our programs are built on consultations with hunters and community members. And even though we pay hunters for their assistance, we consider that we are, that is us working with the community instead of the other way around. So these are the three main pillars for the Arctic Ider Society, including community-driven research, education, and environmental stewardship. And SIKU brings these three pillars together and is available online, which is siku.org, or on your mobile app. So you might recognize some features of SIKU because it's mostly based off of Facebook pages like Nunavut Hunting Stories of the Day. And Nunavut Hunting Stories of the Day was created because we wanted to share our knowledge and stories with each other. But what's different about SIKU is that you can find your old posts, so you organize information through time. And it also focuses on knowledge about ice, wildlife, and harvesting. And it's a safe space to post, and we make a big effort to make sure that people's information is respected on the platform, so that environmental extremists can't steal your photos without your permission, or researchers can't use your data without your permission as well. So these ones are our 4 guiding principles for the app. And when you agree to the terms and conditions, when you create an account, you're going to be pledging to all 4 of these. So number 1, you're respecting Indigenous knowledge and rights holders. And for 2, we're building capacity for Inuit communities to create solutions for environmental stewardship, resource management, and climate change adaptation. 3, that this information is under control of all the community members and that they can grant who can access this information. And people can see your posts, but they won't be able to use any of your data without your permission. And 4, that this information is providing Inuit, again, which is traditional knowledge, and passing on traditional knowledge, such as safe ice conditions for traveling and to preserve our language and culture. In addition, the SIKU app itself has special data management and privacy settings that allow each user to control the information on each post. And we'll get towards that, we'll get more into that towards the end. So SIKU was built by and for Inuit, and for the last 2 years, we've been doing many workshops all over Inuit Nunavut to test and refine the platform. So everything you see on SIKU was built by the workshops that we did in all these communities. And all these workshops led to our official launch of December 2019 at ArcticNet. All right, since the launch, we have had thousands of new user postings, and we've had a few competitions and everything, and we're going to talk about some features very quickly. So there's many different types of posts you can make, as such as wildlife observations, wildlife hunting stories, dangerous ice conditions, ice observations, social posts, and research and instrument postings. So you make these observations while you're out on the land, and when you get back home to internet, you could post them, and other people will be able to view your posts as well as with the map. So this is the overview of the platform of siku.org. And on the left, you'll see the feed, and the feed has ice and weather conditions, user wildlife observations, and hunting stories. And each observation is connected to user profile and project profile, so you can see who made these posts. And you can actually click on their profiles if you want to learn more about them. And on the left, you'll be able to, on the right, you'll be able to see the map. It has icons for each location of each observation, and also as well as satellite imagery. We actually have a variety of satellite imagery that we offer. And you can see how Inuit and science come together in one place, put by there for the community members, so other community members can see them. And it's also a great opportunity for educational purposes as well, for young hunters or new hunters to learn about different ice posts and different wildlife. And so this is an example that we always like to give of a dangerous ice post. So the hunter, his name is Johnny, went out hunting near Sanikiloaq, and he noticed that there was a crack in the ice. And he knew with his traditional knowledge that this was not a normal crack. So he made a dangerous ice post, and when he got back to his community, he posted it to warn his community members. And so you could see on the top right corner, it was posted on February 10th of 2019. And 2 days later, it became a drifting flow edge. So you could see how, again, traditional knowledge and technology put together can greatly benefit communities. And there is, of course, no replacement to learning about these ice conditions from elders or experienced hunters, but it's increasing awareness of dangerous conditions in the same place where you could check your weather. And with the climate changing, it has become harder for Inuit to predict these ice conditions. This is an example of how drastically things are changing in such a short amount of time. Now that you've seen many examples of what SIKU can do, we're excited to show you what we've done, what we developed for the different users to customize data ownership features. And these were made with consultations with many communities. So the privacy settings are available to manage. So you can see, you could show your location, you could hide your location, or you can mask your location of each post. And you can have your post privacy as low so that everyone can view your post, or you could have it as medium so people could see the summary, but they can't look into the details of your posts. And you can have Indigenous stewardship or open access stewardship. So if it's Indigenous stewardship, then you could have your community or Inuit organizations being able to manage your data. And you could do this on a post by post basis, or you could set it as your defaults. So there's also this data dashboard that is available. Each user has a list of all the posts that you have made and all the posts that you have been tagged in. And the functions of what they could do. So you could edit them, you could download them, or you could delete them. It all depends on the stewardship data settings you have as well. And if you want to grant someone this permission, you could download them directly from the website. Overall, through SIKU's customizable tools for researchers and data ownership, we have been able to support community-driven monitoring programs all across Inuit Nunangat for many applications, including environment, climate change, and food security. So in this slide, you can see it's an example of a pilot program that we worked with the Kirtani Inuit Association, which is the regional organization in the Baffin region, and to train hunters to document wildlife observations, harvesting, and land use activities. And this is their Guardians pilot program. And the project was highly successful, and their collective efforts between November to March, and how SIKU could play a key role in supporting community-based monitoring. So in sum, we hope that we showed you some good examples of how Indigenous-driven data ownership and stewardship may look like up here in the Arctic. And thank you for the opportunity for us to share what we've been working on here with SIKU. And if you would like to learn more, please let us know. You could send an email to info@siku.org. Thank you. I'm going to pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Hello, I'm Oscar Figueroa from Mexico, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of our experience working on within the approach of the Indigenous data sovereignty paradigm, and the way we've been starting to set a basic number of principles, which we've expressed in what we call the CARE principles, which in English stand for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So it's relevant for us to care about the way we are using Indigenous data, sharing it, and taking advantage of it, and the way the Indigenous communities should be involved in this whole process. And what I'm going to share with you today is a bit of the experience we've had here in Mexico with the, if I'm sharing my screen. I am right. Okay, so let me just start with a bit of the context of indigenous communities in Mexico and in Latin America in general. Mexico represents one of the largest countries in Latin America regarding the absolute number of indigenous inhabitants. And we have in Mexico some 68 different indigenous languages spoken in the country, belonging to that same number of different indigenous groups, indigenous peoples. And the whole of the indigenous population is mainly distributed in the southern part of the country. And there is a direct correlation with marginalization conditions for indigenous communities in Mexico. So the most marginalized and poorest in the country are indigenous communities, and they're also mainly based in rural settings, like the ones we can see in the pictures. So we've found out that what we've spotted, sort of established a couple of main categories regarding the main issues for indigenous data sovereignty in Mexico, which would be access, which is mainly related to infrastructure, and also relevance. And this is related to capacity building. For instance, in the southern state of Chiapas in Mexico, they have a very nice data platform with a lot of several indicators and a very interesting geographical information system developed. But first, indigenous communities have difficulty accessing, getting the computers, getting the connection, but then also interpreting the whole of the data. This is what we mean with the whole relevance and the need for capacity building. So we have also, within the frame of the principles, started with the exercise of mainly promoting them in the whole of the country. First, we had the principles translated from English to Spanish, and in Spanish we've named them CREA, the CREA principles. Control, the authority to control, responsibility, ethics, and benefit, collective benefit for the communities and the indigenous population. And we also made a little exercise of sort of designing, because of this whole variety of indigenous communities, and in order to work with them and sort of promote the principles and have sort of a mutual understanding of them from the beginning, we thought that the idea of developing these little logos or of the principles are the ones you can see here. The little sort of lock for the control. There's also, they're all designed from indigenous motifs. This is Otomi from the central part of the country, Hidalgo state mainly. Then we have responsibility, which is a Raramuri motif. Then we have ethics, which we sort of inspired from the Huichol or Wirikuta people in the occidental part of the country. And finally, the benefit, the mutual benefit for aprovechamiento para el beneficio colectivo, which was inspired by some Maya motifs from the peninsula of Yucatan in the southeastern part of the country. So we got them translated into Spanish. We began doing that promotion. We are starting in Mexico also with Mexican Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. We are in the process of the creation of it. So there's people from Mexico in the call also. You're all invited to send an email, and if you're interested to collaborate with this effort. And then we started the translation process into some of the main indigenous languages in the country. And this was basically, we started from an exercise I sort of promoted with some of my former students, which were interested and willing to do the effort of translating into their own native languages. So we're doing it now in Mixteco, New Zawi, which is a language spoken in the southern part of the country, mainly the state of Oaxaca and Puebla. There's a little example of it. That's a control principle. We're translating them into Zapoteco, which is also from the southern part of the country, Oaxaca state as well. Oaxaca state in the southern part of the country is one of the most, regarding indigenous population, most populated with indigenous people in Mexico. So this is Zapoteco. For the example, we have the responsibility principle here presented, and also into Triqui. And as I said, these are from students of mine, which were willing to do the effort with their pictures here. Jose, who's working in the Mixteca region, and Eliel in the Zapoteca region, and this is Eliflora, who's from Triqui region. The three regions are from Oaxaca state. And we are working into also, for this, in this translation effort, to sort of get contact with the National Anthropology School and the National Institute for Indigenous Languages, because we find it really important to present the principles and start sort of promoting and letting indigenous communities know about them, and the way they could make them work in their daily context, because we have a lot of issues regarding the use or misuse of data coming from indigenous communities in the whole country. We just recently had another case of alleged plagiarism from international designers of indigenous motifs in the fashion industry. We have the whole issues related to the mega projects and the mineral extraction, which all tend to rely into or to be established into the indigenous areas, which are the natural common lands in the rural parts of the country in Mexico, and so on and so forth. So it is important for us to make this promotion, and through the in progress of creation Mexican Sovereign Data, Indigenous Data Network, work on this promotion as well, and benefit of our indigenous communities. And this is basically a bit of the work we've done and some of the challenges we are facing nowadays. And I'm gonna pass a microphone to Steph now. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to briefly show my video and then turn it off, as I've been having some internet instability here. So welcome, everybody. Sidak Atna Kastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishu Stas, Lendak Melchina. Hi, I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna. I'm a citizen of the native village of Clitica along the Copper River in Alaska. From my father's side, on my mother's maternal grandmother and grandparents' side, I'm of Sicilian descent. I'm going to now share my slides with you. Thank you to the other speakers for providing context for Indigenous data sovereignty. And so I'll just add to the discussion now by expanding on enacting Indigenous data sovereignty through Indigenous data governance in research environments. I'm going to start by acknowledging the Tohono Nation on whose unceded lands, Tucson, Arizona, where I'm located, is I'm paying my respects to the Passamaquoddy tribe, whose people also share these lands. I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and their lands on which you all sit, recognizing that the work for which we gather here today requires a commitment from each one of us to acknowledge the power and equities and honor Indigenous peoples' sovereignty to self-determine their futures and engage in data and data environments. So you've heard a few contexts here today. And so both domestically here in the United States and internationally, communities of practice and advocacy exist through Indigenous data sovereignty focused networks in the US, Canada, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as Indigenous data sovereignty activities in many areas across the globe. In the US, through the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, we've included raising awareness and scholarship around Indigenous rights to govern Indigenous data, promoting ethical use of Indigenous data, advancing institutional policy and practice changes, and advocacy within state and federal governments and programs, from the census to national institutes of health to state governments in relation to data. And so current efforts include supporting the development of tribal data governance principles, some of the work that Desi talked about, so policies and practices, and advocating for Indigenous data sovereignty across research, service delivery, and policy entities. And then developing policy recommendations for non-tribal entities, partnering with colleges and universities to build and support student engagement toward a new generation of data warriors. Magali, Desi, Candace, Oscar all provided examples today of tribal data governance and the interface with Indigenous data governance. So harnessing tribal values, principles, and mechanisms and applying them to the nation's data and how those data are managed. Indigenous data governance is yet another means, as Desi said, of implementing greater Indigenous data sovereignty. And Indigenous data governance really requires us in these external entities. We're not the sovereign, we are stewards, but we need to begin to figure out how to build infrastructure and policies and practices that are aligned with Indigenous ways of knowing and doing when we manage and control, or when we manage Indigenous data broadly within these external settings. So Indigenous data governance can be implemented in these external settings through law, policies and practice, ethics, and infrastructure. These policies and practices both enhance responsibilities to self-determination for tribes from which the data emerged, and also require us to ethically care for aggregate data or data that are not properly attributed to Indigenous peoples. And so sometimes it's easier for us to consider when we're handling data or working with data that we know belongs to or is in relationship with a certain Indigenous tribe. But it becomes more complex when those data don't identify tribe or have not been properly attributed over time. So Oscar introduced the CARE principles, which really detail the use of Indigenous data should result in tangible benefits for Indigenous collectives through inclusive development and innovation, improved governance and citizen engagement, and result in equitable outcomes. And so we really want to think through for these external entities, especially in open science platforms or in open data or in data sharing environments, how do we align our policies and practices with the collective benefit to collectively benefit Indigenous peoples on their own terms, to align with Indigenous peoples' rights and interests and their authority to control such data, and also to have access to data for governance that is vital to support self-determination, and actively support Indigenous nations' involvement in the governance of data to ensure, especially in these open environments, ethical reuse of data. So given the majority of Indigenous data is controlled by non-Indigenous institutions, there's a responsibility to engage respectfully with Indigenous communities to ensure the use of their data supports their rights and interests, and is increasing community data, and also working to increase community data capabilities, as Desi was talking about, and strengthening of Indigenous languages and cultures, as we heard from Megali earlier. So similarly, Indigenous people's ethics should inform the use of data across time, particularly for the purposes of minimizing harm, maximizing benefit, but also to promote justice and allow for future use on Indigenous people's own terms. And so the CARE principles are designed to be complementary to the FAIR principles and promote equitable participation and equitable outcomes from data access, use, reuse, and attribution in contemporary data landscapes. But we know that the vast majority of a lot of data anywhere, but the vast majority of Indigenous data are not fair. And so we have a long road ahead of us. So current mechanisms that are used that can reflect and enact the CARE principles include tribal data governance tools, such as tribal codes, guidelines, and research review processes, but also these relationship-based elements, such as data sharing agreements, as well as other institutions' policies and procedures. And I'll go through some of those in a bit. Some other tools are metadata labels, also provenance, and other types of information that you would attach to data. And so we'll talk through some of that here. I'm going to provide a few examples. The first are traditional knowledge labels. And so these are a set of 18 labels that are applied by Indigenous communities. And so these are digital tags that are machine readable. They establish provenance for Indigenous data. Importantly, they create durable and persistent cultural metadata. And each of these tags that you see here are customizable by the communities. They're used in over 200 communities worldwide right now. And the community can customize them with their own language, meanings, purposes. And I'll give you one quick example here of how they're used in larger data sets. And so the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition here in the US is compiling information into a data set on all boarding schools. And what they're doing is applying the traditional knowledge labels within their system. So here you see the TK attribution label being applied. And what that means is the community has actually applied that label to the information. And so they've sought out, and this is their testing of the labeling system here, how those labels are applied, and will work to have attribution of the information to the correct community be persistent through the data lifecycle in this data set. And so not only have they sought permission to access this information from the external data set or places where these items are located and put them into a new data set, but then they're circling back and creating that relationship with the community from whom these individuals and this information came from in the first place, to identify what traditional knowledge labels should be applied. And so different labels can be applied that show different purposes. And so not only is there an attribution label, but there are other labels that do things such as identify what information is only accessible by communities, and what labels, as well as labels that say there is very, very, very protected information. And so what the suite of labels can do is, I talked about being durable and persistent over time, can put through provenance, so where this information comes from, and also ties a lot of other pieces in there about how that information came to be, but also the purposes of the data. Can it be used for research? Can it be used for commercial purposes? Can it be used for educational purposes? And a whole host of other items that can be put through there. But then also the protocols related to it. And so whether or not it's available external to the community, whether or not if it's seasonally restricted or restricted by gender. And so the control lays with the community for providing this, all these layers of information here. And so one of the kind of difficulties with labeling is it's really an intensive process, right? Especially if you're in an environment where you're not creating new information, but you're going back and you're adding attribution and provenance and protocol information to already existing information, because you then enter into a process where it becomes very laborious. So some other tools that can be used by researcher or institutions are notices. And so notices make visible institutional commitments to Indigenous communities and future use of Indigenous data. And so they support transparency and integrity in research, and they help make Indigenous data fair. So these notices here, the TK, so traditional knowledge, but also a set of notices in development around biocultural information, are used as placeholders on collections or on data or in a sample field or in metadata until a community can apply a TK or a BC label to replace those. And so some of the most prominent notices in use are attribution. So if the attribution is incomplete, you don't know where that data or a belonging should be attributed to, you can put that there. And so those allow researchers to identify and make known that they have a commitment to those relationships and establishing those relationships to allow for provenance attribution and durability of control through the process. And so here's some examples from the Abbey Museum. On the left, you see an example that shows that the community is, a lot of information is filled in the metadata, right? And the institution is saying that they're open to collaboration. So the development of new modes of collaboration, engagement, and partnership for the care and stewardship of this collection item. The item on the right, though, the attribution is not complete for this. There's a possibility that it comes from some peoples, but they're unclear on that. And so there's a need to identify that, and you see a separate label put on for that attribution angle. There's also the ability to put these labels on whole sets. So here you see a cultural institution notice in Geome. So it's a metadata database for geological and genetic sequencing. On the bottom, you see that they have applied the open to collaborate so that they know that they have data in their sets that they want to establish relationships and create new modes of collaboration around those data to make sure that they're being responsible to the data where the data originate from. I'm going to slip through this. Some other applications of the labels and notices that we are working through is talking with the Nature Publishing Group through a forthcoming collection that will come out around genomics, Indigenous genomics, and applying some of these provisionally to some of those pieces. And so you see on the left side there how if a community in the research process has applied labels, those can appear on the information for the article, as well as institutional or researcher notices identifying that they are open to collaboration around those materials. Another space that we're working with is through ORCID to try to think through how the labels might be applied within our researcher profiles within that system. And so this shows you how you can start to create these systems for how an open up space within these systems and infrastructure for allowing for Indigenous rights and interests to become more permanent through the cycle of both attribution and provenance, and allowing for purpose and for protocols to be put into data. Another effort that's underway in the initial phases is to create a recommended practice for the provenance of Indigenous peoples' data through IEEE. This is in the very initial phases of a 4-year process there, and I'm leading that with a couple of other, with Maui Hudson, who's also here at RDA and some of our work groups, and some others. And so, and then one of the important parts is once you start creating space for labels, you begin to realize that you need to transform your policies and practices as well. And usually we think about maybe creating those policies and practices first, but a lot of the work actually comes from these relationships we create with communities and Indigenous peoples to try to raise the level of control that they have over their data in these external systems. So some of the work that we're doing around transforming repositories is really thinking about, from a high level, what are some changes that can be made? Some of those are transforming the deposit agreement so that you require that if Indigenous data is being deposited into a repository, and so like I think of my own institutional repository, you know, a researcher must document how they are respecting the preferences of a tribal nation to share or not share their data. And that comes at the discretion of how the tribe itself wants to document that. Also pursuing how institutions can apply some of those notices or a related statement that they're open to collaboration, and they actually promote collaboration to enable Indigenous control of the data that are within their repositories. I think some of the things that really need to be begun to be thought through for our research repositories are how do you create intellectual property policy within these environments, and how do you deal with ownership considerations? And those are some of the more longer term projects, I think, then really beginning to change the deposit and really the orientation or the ethical statement that comes from making a cultural institution notice there. One of the last things I wanted to say is, you know, I talked about how you can make changes within law, policy, ethics, and infrastructure. One of the things that has happened most recently is IATSIS, or the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, released an updated code of ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research in October last month. And it's in its initial stages of a 12-month implementation process with the National Health Medical Research Council and the Australian Research Council, to ensure that the code is successfully integrated within the broader framework for ethical and responsible conduct of research in Australia itself. But the new IATSIS code contains specific language around Indigenous data sovereignty and governance, which you see here, and really calls out the need for both FAIR principles and the CARE principles to be implemented across data systems, especially in research environments. And so really what we're thinking about here is, as across the data life cycle, how do we create policies and practices and then actual tools that allow us to have Indigenous participation in open science, to share data on their own terms and create durable and persistent mechanisms for provenance and protocol and purpose within these very non-Indigenous spaces. And then I'll end with a plug that we have 3 more sessions during RDA P16 on Indigenous data sovereignty that you see here, 2 tomorrow and 1 the following day. So please do join us if you'd like to.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to all our panelists. I think we are almost at the end of the hour and a half that we had. Maybe we will have, I don't know, a time for 1 or 2 questions. I have one that was posted just the beginning of the panel about that balance that we have to have between sovereignty of data, of indigenous data, and the need to share that data. And then he says that if you think that maybe the technologies can ensure sovereignty, but enhancing data sharing. I don't know if any one of you want to answer that.
I can try. I don't know if you can hear me, but I believe that's the question by.
Yes, let me see.
When data, may we use technologies, how can technology be used to ensure sovereignty, but also enhance data sharing? And so I think, we are in this global, data is this, the global currency. Obviously, indigenous nations are within, our contemporary nations. There's this need to, kind of understand and really start to grapple with, issues of big data, data sharing, data linkage. And so I guess I'm not, I think, technology can be used for good. It can also be used for harm, as we know. And we know that particularly in the case of Indigenous peoples, where so many Indigenous communities have sought social exclusion as opposed to social inclusion in order to try to protect what little we have left. And so I think that type of thinking also needs to be applied to the data world and understanding that what does inclusion mean on Indigenous terms? What does exclusion mean on Indigenous terms? And how can that balance ever be attained? And ultimately, yes, sovereignty, if sovereignty is at the core of that, then I do believe it can be attained, but we must always fall back onto the sovereignty of tribal nations to determine that level of technology use, of inclusion and exclusion.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And that's something that I wanted to ask you too, any of you, about how the non-Indigenous organizations of people see that sovereignty issues of the Indigenous people. Because as you say, we can understand differently what sovereignty is and what sharing is. Okay, especially when you have been sharing what you want, and in the opposite side, you are sharing what is taken from you. Well, I think there are some questions that are directly for each one of you, for Candice or. Okay, Julia Collins says, rather than a product, I mean that it means to be customized by the community using it. It's a blank slate framework for developing map-based stories. Yes, that is that experience with maps. Well, I think, and anyway, the Indigenous panel will be continuing in the next days with those three activities that Stephanie just tell us. Then we invite everyone to attend those panels, those breakouts, and I'm sure most of the questions can be answered there, or you will have this panel tomorrow because it's being recorded. Then you will have all the information of the panelists, and then you can write them. So I say goodbye. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the panelists and all to the assistants, attendees here in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Gabby. Thanks all. And thanks everyone for joining. On to our next breakout in about an hour and a half. Thanks, StreamPoint. We'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.